Let's turn in our Bibles back to Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Now, have you ever looked at someone and thought to yourself, I could do their job, and I bet you I could even do it better than they do it? I'm guessing maybe you've come across people like that in your life that you thought, yeah, I could do that better. When we see people, particularly people in positions of authority, slacking off or making stupid decisions or only halfway committed to their role, it really grates against our nerves, doesn't it? Or for most of us, it does. Well, it grated against Solomon's nerves too. And actually, throughout the wisdom literature of the Bible, we find a common theme that laziness destroys, while diligence builds up and provides success. And so it's no surprise that here, as we're nearing the end of Ecclesiastes, and Solomon is covering a few seemingly random topics from the vantage point of wisdom, it's no surprise that he makes sure to say something about diligence and slothfulness, and he applies it in particular to the leaders of the nation and how important diligence is for them. We're going to see in this passage today that the fact that there is great wisdom in pursuing diligence. In fact, I think the main point we can take away from these 5 verses is that wise diligence brings benefit at national and personal levels. Wise diligence brings benefit at the national level, and it brings benefit from my own life personally. And so we should pursue it, and we should persevere even when we find ourselves under the authority of those who don't pursue diligence. Does that make sense? Wise diligence brings benefit at national and personal levels, so we should pursue it, and we should persevere under those who don't. We're going to look at how Solomon describes the benefit of wisdom at a national level and then at a more personal level, and finally, his words of advice to those of us who find ourselves under the authority of lazy leaders. Let's dig in here and see the wisdom of diligence described here. The first level at which Solomon talks about it is at the national level. He talks about how diligence makes leaders a blessing to their nation rather than a curse. He says in verse 16 of Ecclesiastes 10, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning." So he starts off with a negative example, which I'm calling immature, self-indulgent leaders. You might have noticed when Larry was reading this passage earlier that the translation he was reading from said, "Woe to you, land, when your king is a servant," or was a servant. And that's because the word used there, it can either be translated as child or servant. It's used all throughout the Old Testament. Most often it is used to speak of adolescent boys. Okay, so a child or a young man, a lot of times it'll speak about the young men who are attending to, King David or whoever. And so that's why some translations choose to go with the word child there. It's also used as a reference to servants, and so some translations use the term servant. Either way, I think what that word is getting at here is not that the land, the king of the land is young in biological age, or that he used to be a servant because, servants are the worst in all cases or whatever. He's using that term for child or servant to refer to immaturity. Okay? We know from the book of, 1st or 2nd Kings, that there was a young boy named Josiah who became king of Israel, and he was actually a great blessing to the nation because he followed the Lord. He listened to the wise counselors, and even though he was, like 8 years old, 12 years old? 7 or 8, something like that. Even though he became king at a very young age, he was still a blessing to the land. Solomon is not here just saying, "Woe to you, land, when your king is young in age." He's talking about He's talking about not having that wisdom. And we see more proof of this in the way that Solomon himself used that same word when he was praying to God. This is what Solomon said to the Lord when Solomon first became king, and God appeared to him in a dream and said, "What do you want me to give you?" And Solomon asked for wisdom. He didn't ask for riches and honor and wealth. He asked for wisdom. We find this in 1 Kings chapter 3. Here's how Solomon introduced his request. In verses 9 and 10, he says this: "Give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this great people?" That's actually the end of his prayer. What am I looking at here? 1 Kings 3, verse 7. I got to back up. Let me read verse 5 for you. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. You kept for him this great and steadfast love, and you've given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant," he's talking about himself, "you've made me king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child." There's that word. "Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in." Is he saying, literally, I'm a toddler and I don't know how to walk out the door and walk back in? No, he's saying, I don't have the maturity, I don't have the wisdom to know how to govern your people. So therefore, that verse that I accidentally read earlier, therefore, God, give me wisdom to understand. Here in Ecclesiastes, very likely Solomon wrote it, and very likely near the end of his life, as he's looking back, he says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child," when they are immature, when they don't have that wisdom to attend to their duties properly. And notice that he says, "Woe to you, O land." We might not feel the impact of that word because we don't use woes that much in our day and age, right? We don't say, "Woe to you, I'm going to, blast you in this video game," something like that. But woes are a big deal in Scripture. The prophets would usually pronounce a woe upon the people. It was a pronunciation of God's judgment upon the people. And the word for woe that he's using here is not exactly that same prophetic woe of pronouncing God's judgment, but it still carries this weightiness to it, that this is a very bad situation for this land when their king is immature and doesn't attend to his duty properly. Solomon had used that same word for woe back in chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, where he says, "Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. If they fall, one will lift up the other. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up." Solomon used that term woe already to talk about the sorry state of this guy who falls all by himself and doesn't have anybody there to pick him up. Now he's saying your land is in that same sorry state if you have a king who is childish. And what are the princes, the officials, doing in the second half of verse 16? "And your princes feast in the morning." So what are they doing? They're feasting. They're filling their own bellies in the morning instead of doing their job, being out there governing, attending to the duties that they have as princes of the land. It's all about immaturely just kind of looking for what I can get out of this powerful position, rather than how I can use the power I've been entrusted with to serve my people, to make life better for those in the nation, others in the nation. He says, "Woe to you, land, when this is the state of your leadership." They're immature, they're self-indulgent, they're lazy, they're just in it for whatever they can get out of it. But then he flips around and looks at a positive example in verse 17. Happy are you, O land, when your king is a son of nobility and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Diligence is needed in these leaders. It's here again when he says, happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility. Now, being a son of nobility refers to, I think, character as much as social status. He's not just saying that every son who is born to a nobleman is automatically a wise and a great leader. But the sons of nobility, those born to noblemen, would have been exposed to the kind of training needed to govern a nation well. And so it's more often than not that the sons of nobility would have the character required to govern well. They would be more aware of their duty to serve their country, not just to serve themselves. And so he says, happy are you, O land, when your king is the kind of guy that knows what his duty is to his country and actually does it. He's diligent to act in a way that a king should. And then what are the princes doing? There's another parallel here, right? The king is a childish king, or the king is a son of nobility. And then another parallel, the princes are feasting in the morning, verse 16, verses here in verse 17, the princes are feasting at the proper time. They're feasting at the proper time. They're still feasting, right? The princes are still feasting. Being a leader, as Solomon is outlining it here, doesn't just mean that life is all work and no play. But he says these wise, these good, these diligent princes are feasting at the right time. Perhaps they're celebrating a victory in battle. Perhaps they're making wise political moves, holding a feast to have the right kinds of political conversations. There's somebody else, a daughter of nobility, who demonstrated that kind of wisdom in the book of Esther, right? Bet you can't guess who it was. Yes, it was Esther, the one that book is named after. She put together a feast, right, when she wanted to have this delicate political conversation with the king about saving her own people, right? She said, let me put on a dinner for you. Come over and have a dinner party. And she invited Haman and all that kind of stuff. You can go read it for yourself. So these guys are feasting at the proper time. What's the purpose of their feasting? He says it's for strength, not for drunkenness. Their feasting is at the proper time and it has the proper purpose for strength. They're not just partying for their own pleasure at the expense of their people. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, it talks about, at the end of Proverbs 31, it says, it's not for kings, O Lemuel, not for kings to drink wine and rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Right? It's like, you got a job to do, king. So when you're enjoying the finer things of life, just make sure that you're not ignoring the rights of the people under you. That you're not just giving pleasure to yourself and forgetting about the people that you're supposed to be caring for and ruling. The princes described here in Ecclesiastes 10:17, they're feasting at the proper time. They're doing it to gain strength for the necessary work that they must do. They're not just trying to get drunk and enjoy themselves. They want to diligently continue in their duties as princes. That's kind of the picture, the implication, I think, that we get from here. So diligence, the kind of working attitude that these princes have in verse 17, makes leaders a blessing on their land. Happy are you, O land, when this is the case for your leaders, right? But woe to you, O land, if this is not the case. If your leaders are just making themselves fat off the backs of everyone else. And it's easy to take a couple of verses like this and kind of analyze our own government leaders, right? To say, okay, this is a great passage for them. They need to hear this. They need to do something about this. And these principles do apply to national leadership of other nations, not just Israel. I think we can rightly apply this kind of a passage as we think about our own leaders in our own nation, as we think about our own leaders here within the church family. We ought to be thinking about these kinds of principles. To what extent does diligence characterize the leaders that we have? It ought to impact the way that we vote for political candidates, right? The grid, the evaluation grid that you use to decide who you're going to vote for, it ought to include something like this, principles like this. Are they the kind of person that I can trust based on what I can see of their life, that they're actually going to do the things they say they're going to do, that they know what their job is in whatever political position they're running for, and that they will actually attend to that in a godly way, or at least in a way that I can feel comfortable voting for them. These sorts of things. Diligence, the diligence that someone displays toward their duty at a national level or a state or local level ought to play a factor. But keep in mind at the same time that Solomon's primary audience here would have been the princes of the land. Who is Solomon writing Ecclesiastes for? We just have to keep in mind that, back in the days when Solomon is writing this, he's not like sending it off to the publisher, P&R Publishing or whatever, and then they're going to print 500,000 copies and put it out in all the bookstores in Jerusalem for the common man to come along. Oh, new book out by the king. Let me leaf through it and see what I think. No, there were no printing presses. If you wanted to make more than one copy of this, scribes had to sit down and write it all out by hand. Right? And so, when Solomon is writing this book of wisdom, talking about the vanity of living just for this life and how we need to have our eyes on a more eternal perspective and how we need to live with wisdom even in the short lives that we have, the kind of people in his immediate sphere of influence that he's writing to, I think, would have been the princes of the land. And so, when he says here, woe to you, land, when your princes act like this, and happy are you, land, when your princes act like this, there's an implied challenge there. That the guys who are receiving this word are being like, oh, that's me. He's talking about me. Which kind of prince am I being? Am I being attentive to the duty that I've been given? The job, the work, whatever that I've been entrusted? Or am I just using whatever power I have to please myself, to get drunk in the morning instead of serving my people? There's an implied challenge, I think, here to not just think, oh, what do my leaders need to take away from this? But to say, what do I need to take away from this? Am I exercising the kind of diligence that is a blessing in the way God intended my life to be a blessing upon others? What am I doing with the position of power or influence that I have been given? Am I squandering it for my own pleasure, or am I serving with diligence? Am I stewarding the gifts, the abilities, the position that God has put me in? That's what I want us to think about as we think about even just these first two verses. How might this principle impact the way that we view and vote for and whatever our leaders? But then also, how does this impact my own leadership of others? Because others are looking to you in one sense or another. Even if you don't see yourself as being a leader or being in a leadership position, you have a unique place in life. And God is giving you an opportunity to tend to that place that you have in life? Are you going to do it with diligence? So diligence makes leaders a blessing, but then Solomon kind of broadens the scope here of what he's talking about. Diligence is going to be necessary if the nation or organization will flourish, but that value of diligence applies to our personal situations, and so the next couple verses seem to kind of broaden things out. In verses 18 and 19, he doesn't explicitly mention any leaders or princes or kings or anything. He's talking more in general about sloth and diligence. And of course, as he did already, he gives a negative example first. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. That word indolence, I like other translations that say, stillness of hands or idle hands. Yes, thank you. Idleness of hands. That's what indolence means. I was like, what on earth is that? What does that mean? I Googled indolence, definition. So, idle hands, okay. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. Now, there are many commentators that will just apply verses 18 and 19 to the overall concept of leadership. So they say this is still talking about national leaders. And I think that it's fair to do that, to say that verses 16 and 17 are to be read within the context of verses 18 and 19. They inform each other's context. But since it's less explicit, it doesn't mention kings and princes or whatever, it does leave the door open to applying these truths to our own personal households. And the overall picture that we get here in verse 18 is things are just crumbling down around the lazy person, right? That's the overall picture. Through sloth, the roof sinks in. Through idleness of hands, the house leaks. Now, you would never pass a nice house like this. You'd never drive past a nice, well-kept house like this and think, oh, that's a pretty nice abandoned building there. Right? You might say that about this kind of house. You might say, oh, that looks abandoned. Why? Because we know that this happens naturally if you leave the house alone for a while. This does not happen naturally, right? A house doesn't just build itself and the lawn gets cut and the bushes are nicely trimmed and there's fresh mulch out there and the lights are on. That doesn't just happen by accident. How does it happen? By someone diligently attending to the needs of the house. When the pipe leaks, they either fix it because they know how or they call a plumber to come in and fix it, right? When you start to get cracks in the foundation, you have to hire out a company to assess, okay, how are we going to deal with this? What naturally happens is that things go crumbling down around us. It's called entropy, I think. Things naturally crumble around us, and it requires diligent attention to our duties to keep things in good working order. And that's what Solomon is getting at here. You can tell when the house is crumbling in that somebody has not been very diligent to attend to the needs of that house. And this can be seen as a metaphor for other things too. He's not just talking about a physical structure. And I don't think he's just talking about a nation either. That the house of the nation will crumble, although that is certainly true. Lazy self-indulgence can bring many things crashing down around us. If we are not diligent to attend to our marriages, to invest time and energy and love and care into this other person that I've committed my life to, if we are lazy and just try to get what I can out of it instead of pouring into the house of my marriage, then that can crumble around me. Friendships can be the same way. A job or schooling opportunities, if we're not diligent in pouring into these things, we feel the consequences. Things can come crumbling down around us. even our physical health, right? If we're not diligent to attend to the things when the doctor says, oh, you should be eating more leafy greens and less saturated fats, and you should be exercising or whatever, He's not just saying that because the gym up the road paid him to say it. We need to take care to ensure that we are being diligent in attending to the house that we live in. So, negative example, and then I'm calling this one a positive example in verse 19. What does verse 19 say? Bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. So there you have it, folks. The Bible says money is the answer to everything. Go make as much money as possible and be blessed, right? What's going on here? There's one very popular interpretation of verse 19 here, and that is to say that verse 19 is describing the viewpoint of those lazy, childish leaders we've been talking about, right? To say verse 16 talks about these childish king and princes who are just living for themselves, and they're, just getting whatever they can out of their people, not serving them. Verse 18 talks about the slothful person, the rafters are sinking, the walls are breaking open, all this kind of thing. And so they say, okay, verse 19 is their perspective. Bread is for laughter, wine gladdens our life, and money's going to answer all of our problems. Let's just throw money at the problem, right? We're just gonna answer the issue with money. And I think that definitely makes sense. I'm not totally convinced by that. I still think that verse 19 is giving us more of a positive example, not just a negative one. There's a couple of reasons. One being that so far in the immediate context here, context is always a key consideration, we've seen positive and negative examples given, right? We haven't just seen negative examples, we've seen negative and positive. And so we don't have to take this as just a negative example. Also, elsewhere in the same book of Ecclesiastes, we're told that we ought to get joy from bread and wine. Just a chapter before, in chapter 9, verse 7, what did Solomon say? Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart. Sounds a lot like bread is made for laughter and wine gladdens life, right? Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved of what you do. I like an alternate translation that's provided in the New American Commentary, which puts it this way, here, verse 19. People prepare food for pleasure, and wine makes life joyful, but money pays for both. So rather than saying money is the answer to everything in the way that we might use that phrase, what could be going on here is that he's saying money is the answer for these things that I've been talking about. The everything encompassed in verse 19. You're going to need at least some money to pay for that bread and that wine that will gladden your life. If you're going to take the advice of chapter 9, verse 7, which says, go eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, you're going to need to have at least something in the bank to buy that bread and to buy that wine, right? And so, the implication here is that food and drink are good things, but you need at least some money to pay for them, so you'd better pay diligent attention to keeping your house in order. Does that make sense? So if the negative example is the lazy person who just lets the house come crumbling down around him, then here the positive example would be a person who's diligent to attend to the needs of his house so that he is able to enjoy the good gifts that God has given him. You're going to need diligence to attend to the stuff in your life so that you can enjoy these good gifts. Now, diligence in your financial affairs is not going to ensure that you become rich. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying here that the point is to become rich. But I think what Solomon is doing here is he's basically giving us advice on how to keep money from just burning a hole in your pocket, so to speak, right? You got to make sure that you're not just living for your own pleasures so that you can enjoy life's good gifts. So clearly, there's a need for diligence, both in the leadership of nations and in our own personal lives as well. But the reality is we can really only do something about that second issue, right? I can do a lot more about my own personal life than I can do about the leadership of nations. Yes, we can vote, we can make our voice heard, but at the end of the day, there's a couple other 100 million people or whatever that are going to also make their voice heard, right? And I'm not going to be able to just dictate what happens in the hearts and minds of our leaders. We can't guarantee that our leaders will attend to their duties with wise diligence. And so Solomon has a key piece of advice for us on that front as he ends chapter 10 here. I'm calling this third point, my leaders aren't diligent, now what? He says in verse 20, even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice and some winged creature will tell the matter. So the first thing that we notice here he's telling us to do is to show the proper respect to those in leadership. The verse doesn't specify here why we might be tempted to curse the king, right? But the context at least gives us one reason. He's not doing his job. He's letting the house crumble. He's feasting in the morning instead of at the proper time for strength, right? We might be tempted to curse the king. And he says, don't do it. Not even in your thoughts. This is a call to patient discretion, and it kind of echoes what we saw earlier in chapter 10 verse 4, where it says, if the anger of a ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. I think the point of verse 4 and also here verse 20, the point is basically hang in there. Hang in there. I know life is unfair. I know the king isn't going to like you all the time. His anger might rise up against you, or he might not be doing his job properly, and your anger might rise up within you against him. But hang in there. Show the proper respect, because it's not your job to be judge and jury over everything in this world. When he says there, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, that again, that term rich really has to do with a position of authority. It's not just talking about rich people in general. Riches and authority often go hand in hand, particularly in biblical writing. So when he says, even in the most private space of your home, don't curse the rich. He's saying, don't speak bad of those in authority. And this call to kind of hang in there, to show proper honor, to show proper respect to those in authority, echoes what we see even in the New Testament, where the Apostle Peter tells Christians to fear God and honor the king in 1 Peter chapter 2, right? And you know who the king was? The Roman Emperor Nero, who would go on to use Christians as human torches, right? So he certainly wasn't on the side of the Christians when Peter says, fear God and honor the king. Paul, the Apostle Paul, says the same things to the Christians in Rome. In the book of Romans, he talks about showing proper respect and honor to our leaders. And we've talked about this before. The caveat we always have to use or say when we talk about honoring authority is that there are times when the Bible makes it clear when the authority, when government or whoever, their commands specifically go against what God has commanded us to do, well then the apostles give us the example, we must fear God rather than man, right? But it starts here. It starts with the proper respect. And it's interesting the reasoning that Solomon gives here. The reason is your words can haunt you, right? A little bird might carry your voice. Apparently this terminology that, a little birdie told me, that's been around for quite a while. A little birdie told me this. Now we carry our little birdies around with us in our pockets, right? And they're always listening. I love you, Siri. Don't hurt me. But you've experienced this, right? Where you're like talking with a friend about something, and then the next thing you know, ads for that very thing are popping up on your email or social media or whatever. How did they know? A little birdie was in your bedroom hearing you talk. Our words can come back to bite us. We never know how far our words will travel. And so it's wise that we take to heart what we studied last week about the importance of our words, right? Solomon says, if you know what's good for you, keep those complaints to yourself. But I think we can go a step further than Solomon goes here, because we've got a lot more Bible that we can reference than what Solomon had. The one greater than Solomon came along who was that perfect leader, who was perfectly attentive to his duty. He is the perfect king of kings. And so as we persevere in showing respect, as we persevere in the messiness of this life, when leaders don't lead the way they ought to, when diligence is hard, keep staying diligent in what I am called to do is hard, we remember our perfect leader. I love the way Zach Eswine talks about this in his book, Recovering Eden, the Gospel According to Ecclesiastes. He says this, what the preacher laments, he's talking about Solomon here in Ecclesiastes, what the preacher laments, the one greater than he takes up. Jesus takes up every foolish leader that we have endured and every foolish act of leadership that we have perpetrated on others. Every act of Jesus, promoting the humble, resisting entitlement, surrendering to limits, talking truly, and using time appropriately is applied to pay for our every act of indulging the proud, seeking immunity, demanding entitlement, exploiting limits, talking big, and using time inappropriately toward the hurt of others. In his life, death, and resurrection, Jesus recovers the character of God's leadership that Eden experienced. There, God led us in wisdom. Here, God will lead us still wisely until he comes, and no more will he suffer a fool to reign. Amen, right? That's the hope that we look forward to. We look to Jesus as that perfect king. And we know that he is at work even in the struggles and the hardships of this broken world. I want to suggest two takeaways for us based on the diligence, the wisdom and diligence that we see here. First of all, we need to pray for our earthly leaders, don't we? The next time you catch yourself about to complain about the incompetency or the slothfulness of someone in government, stop and pray for them instead. There's nothing wrong with praying that God would wake up our leaders, would motivate them to attend diligently to their role. Or, if that isn't the Lord's plan, it's not a wrong thing to pray that, Lord, if that's not your plan, then please remove slothful, incompetent, and wicked leaders from their positions. Lord, please place godly, diligent people into those positions, right? We can pray. And leaders in church need your prayers too. We need a lot of the Lord's work in our hearts to give us that diligence and that wisdom in the roles that He's given to us. So we can think about this in the big picture, but then let's also make it personal. Let's recommit to diligence and just pick one area this week. Is there a necessary project that you've been avoiding out of slothfulness? Maybe now is the time to recommit to Bible reading or memorization or regular prayer in your weekly routine. Are you struggling with the temptation to slack off in your job? Maybe you need to commit to being a help to your parents this summer during summer break instead of just having unlimited me time to veg out, right? What does diligence in your life look like this week? Are the rafters of your marriage sagging? Perhaps you need to put some time and effort into caring for your spouse this week. Let's be people who pursue godly diligence and who persevere even under those who don't, right? Let me pray for us. I pray, Lord, that you would drive these things home in our hearts. I certainly need it. Lord, would you convict us and empower us to live in diligent attention to the things that you've given to us to do. Lord, give us your grace as we struggle, as we're frustrated when we see others not living this way. When we see wickedness and sloth and self-serving attitudes all around us and even within us. In our own hearts, Lord, when we see that, it ought to grieve us. And I pray that you would work in us to give us the perseverance we need, give us the empowering grace to change. And I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.